Hey guys, this episode we're going to be talking about how to use the stimulus values API, and we're going to take an example of a JavaScript snippet for this countdown timer for my Black Friday sale, and we're going to convert that to a stimulus controller that's way easier to work with and way easier to manage. So let's dive in. This is the snippet of JavaScript that I've been using for the past couple years. I copy-pasted this from Stack Overflow or something, and it very simply registers an interval, and it calculates the time between these two dates, and then displays the days, hours, minutes, and seconds between those two in a countdown that updates every second. So it's pretty straightforward, but this is not a great way of doing things. So let's refactor this and set up a different countdown here at the bottom. And we are gonna, let me make this one smaller for the old one, and we'll have the bigger one set up. So we're gonna set this up as a stimulus controller. So we're gonna have data controller, and we'll have ours called countdown. And then that will look for app JavaScript controllers, countdown controller. And we can start defining our stimulus controller. Now, in our old version of this, we have a hard-coded date here, and that gets registered as a date, and then we get the time, and then we set up our interval. And we really want this time to be not hard-coded anymore. So what we can do is actually move that to our HTML, and we can say data countdown value, date value or time value or something. We'll set that as an attribute inside of our HTML. So then our stimulus controller can say static values equals, and we'll have that date, and this will be a string. And stimulus is able to basically parse these types, some basic types, not dates actually, so that's why we have it as a string. But it can parse that attribute out and then assign that as a variable automatically for us in our stimulus controller. So if we have a connect callback here, we can say this.endTime equals the same thing we do up here. Basically, we want a new date object, and instead of the hard-coded string, we can reference this.dateValue get time, and basically we've recreated this line here. So if we console.log this.endTime, and we also console log countdown date, we should be able to refresh the page and see that those are matching exactly, and they are. So that's good. Our calculation is able to pull that in the same way as the old version. Now the next piece is setting up an interval. And an interval is just a timer that runs every X number of milliseconds. In this case, it is running every 1,000 milliseconds. And it calls a function. This one happens to be an anonymous function that's in line here. It doesn't have a name or anything. It just calls that, and it passes the function in as the first argument. Now for us, we want to do something similar. So we'll end up saying this.timer equals set interval. And we want to call a function, and we want it to happen every 1,000 milliseconds. Now, when we navigate away to a different page, we want to actually disconnect this so we can have this work safely with Turbo and anything else. Otherwise, if we create an interval, it will just run forever until the page reloads. And of course, with Turbo and Turbo links, we are clicking on different pages, and the full page is not actually refreshing. It is actually doing that with a fetch request. So it's faster, but the JavaScript doesn't get fully restarted. So we need to be careful to clear out our timer on disconnect. So we'll add a disconnect method here, and this is simple. We will say clear interval, and we will say this.timer in order to do that. And that would work fine, but we may also need to disconnect the timer when the deal has expired. So the first time that we calculate this, we want to go through and check to see if the difference is actually in the past. So if the ending was in the past, we can clear the interval and just say, hey, deal's expired, and that's it. And we don't need to update the page every second. So on our disconnect, we need to stop the timer But we also want to make this reusable, so we're going to extract that out as a stop timer method. And here we can do a little safety check and say, look, if there is a timer variable here, then we'll clear it. But otherwise, if you tried to stop the timer and there wasn't one yet, won't worry about it. So this is going to make that reusable for later on when we clear the interval in the countdown if it was expired. So that gives us now a function that we can call every 1 second. But if you notice, we have a hard-coded value again, and that is 1,000 milliseconds. And this would be much better if it was a configurable option, so we can have it update every half a second, every quarter of a second, or more often, depending on the resolution that we need in this example. So it's nice to make those any hard-coded values configurable. So we'll do that here. We'll say this .refresh interval value, and we will add a refresh interval value here. Now this one's going to be a number, but there is no way for us to just say 1,000 and it figure out the type. So we have to actually pass in an object here. And this is going to be type is number with default is 1,000. So if you have a string like this, the default's going to be an empty string. If you have a number and you don't specify a default, the value will be 0. So these defaults are now overridable in the latest stimulus, which is super nice. It allows us to provide a good value, but you can also go and override that in your HTML. So data countdown refresh interval value equals 500. And so that's going to call this function that currently doesn't do anything twice a second. So we'll leave that, and we can see that that will be changeable. And we need to actually update something on the page in order to see those changes. So we really want to call like a tick method every time that it updates. Maybe we call this update or something like that. Whatever is sounds the best to you. We can have this update method basically calculate the time difference and then the days, hours, minutes, and seconds and update the text on the page. But if the time has expired, we will have it go and update the text and say whatever expire message we want and then cancel that timer. So we have a couple things that we need to do every time that we call this method. So let's work on that. We want to first calculate the time difference, and we will make a method for that. Time difference. This is going to return the difference between this .end time and new date get time, which is the current time. So pretty straightforward. That will calculate that time difference. We can say console.log the difference here. And if we refresh our page, what we should see is we get a number every half a second. So this is happening pretty often. And if we change this to maybe every 5 seconds, we'll wait 5 seconds. It'll display the first one. And then we wait another 5 seconds and it'll display the next one. So 5 seconds is way too long. Every half a second might be good, but definitely every 1 second is a good default for a countdown timer. So this time difference is being calculated well, and it is the number of seconds or whatever between the two dates. Now we have this distance where it was doing the same thing, just assigning the current time to a variable called now. We don't really need that ever, so we can just have a method that returns the time difference between the ending and the current time. So then it gets us that distance, and we can copy the calculations here for the days, hours, minutes, and seconds left, and we can then pull those over as well. Now we need to calculate those days, but one of the things that this does is does the calculation before it actually checks to see if the distance is less than 0, which is a little strange. So it does this work, and then it just kind of ignores the results if the timer has expired. So it'd be better if we have this set up where if the difference is less than 0, we can catch that immediately before we do those calculations and update the text on the page. So this will be this.element.text content, and this will point to the element that the data controller is on, so our span. It will update the text inside of it, whereas this was doing inner HTML, but it didn't even write any HTML. We could use inner HTML if you want to have, bold or underlines or any other like HTML content inside of your formats. But since we're not using that, we're just going to use text content. And this needs to be that expired message. But again, that's a hard-coded string that would be great if we could extract into an option. So if we say this dot expired message value, that's going to set it up so that we can add a static value up here. So expired message. This one will be type string, and the default for this can be something like this deal has ended. A little bit friendlier than just expired, and so on. So now if we go back to our update, we can then call this.stop timer, and we can return from this because we don't need to do anything else. So that works great. And then we can continue on to the next piece where the timer just needs to do the calculation and update. So we're going to say the same kind of thing, math.floor, distance, but in our case we call this difference instead. And that's going to be 1000 times 60 times 60 times 24. So basically we have 1000 milliseconds, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 24 hours in a day. So we can go through and update the rest of these to match. And they do the same kind of calculation, but just give us the number of hours left, subtracting the number of days, and so on. So we'll change distance on each one of those over to difference. We can use that same calculation for that. And then we can go and say this.element.text content equals, and instead of just adding strings together when we want to finally display and render our timer, we can take this and we can make that backticks. And backticks allow you to interpolate strings or variables into strings just like we do in Ruby. So instead of adding these variables and strings together, we can combine that into something that looks a lot nicer. So here we'll say minutes and seconds, and there we go. So if we put our last backtick on there, this is now going to render our timer. So they're both going to update about the exact same time. They have separate timers. They are rendering out the exact same text and everything, and we have now a well-built countdown. So if we change this to the past, we should see this says this deal has ended, and that is now our expired timer because that is a date in the past. So that's good. And if we update this, we'll notice that there are those 3 dots that are displaying a little bit before it renders. Now, the issue with that on the old one was we had an anonymous function. And when you run an interval, it waits that amount of time before it runs the very first function call. So that 1 second that we define, it actually waits a second before it calls this function. So we had no easy way of setting up this function call to run immediately in our old code without moving it and adding a name to the function. But in our new version, because we've done that, we can call this.update immediately after we calculate and parse that time. And this will render it instantly as it connects, and then it will start that timer and then continue updating. So it's much faster to be able to do it this way and much cleaner. So we've got that name on the function now, and that helps a lot. So we can call it immediately. Now the last thing that I want to do here is we have the backtick string, again, hard-coded, and we can copy this and make some sort of either a message or maybe a format, whatever we would like our value to be named. But we can go and take this, remove that, put it up here, and switch it to a regular string with the $ curly braces. This is not going to interpolate those, but it does allow our HTML to say, this is where I would like you to put the days, hours, minutes, and seconds. And our calculation down here can say this.message value dot replace, and we want the days string or substring to be replaced with days. And we want the same thing to happen for hours, minutes, and seconds. So hours should be the hours variable, minutes should be the minutes variable, and seconds should be seconds. Now what that allows us to do is go into our HTML and then say data countdown message value equals anything we would like. So hello world seconds, and we could then say minutes. We'll maybe put the full word after them as well, and ignore hours and days. And there we go, it works. It's able to replace those in basically G-sub as you would do in Ruby, the string with the variable, and then we have now a configurable format for our countdown timer. So this is really, really flexible now. We don't have any hard-coded strings, we don't have any hard-coded timers, none of that is a problem. Now, one of the things that we will run into an issue with, if we remove that time and forget to put that on there, let's say we just had a data controller countdown. This is going to then try to calculate the difference in time between this date that doesn't exist, which is an empty string, which is probably going to do something weird. If we don't have that date, what happens? Is it going to blow up? Well, it just gives us not a numbers for our days, hours, minutes, and seconds. So it looks really funny, like a Batman time or something. But we can add a little bit of code in here to say, look, if this date value is present, so has date value is something you can use in Stimulus, we can then render that and connect up. Otherwise, we can give you an error, and we can say, look, there's a missing data countdown date value attribute, and we could then even render out, say, this dot element. So you knew exactly what element that was for. So we can print out that element. You can actually reveal an elements panel if you right click on that, and it will show you exactly which element on the page is missing the date. So now if we put this back, we can get our hello world back and the time back, and there's no error in our console. And our stimulus controller can very nicely say, hey, you're missing this attribute, it's required, even though the values, currently at least, maybe they will add that in the future, do not have a way to say this is a required attribute. So maybe that's something that will be added in the future, but for now, this is a really easy way to go and validate those. So look, our JavaScript grew a little bit. We have now 58 lines of JavaScript here, and we had 20 some lines over on this side. But what we've really gained here is we've gained flexibility. We have values that we can pass in as options and override things. We can use this countdown for anything. We can change the messaging very easily. And we're not copy pasting this snippet of code around. And all of this stuff works nicely with Stimulus and Turbo. So when we navigate pages, this will connect and disconnect automatically for us, and that countdown timer will be handled correctly. So this has grown a lot because we've given everything nice names, we've made things interchangeable, and we've organized the code much, much better. It's way more maintainable and easier to work with, especially in Rails applications using Hotwire. So that's it for this episode. This is just something that I was refactoring the other day, getting ready for Black Friday, and I thought it would be very useful to show off the Stimulus Values API. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will talk to you in the next one. Peace.